The structure had been waiting for 10,000 years. It floated in the dead space between the three great arms of the galaxy, where no star burned and no planet turned, and no living thing had any reason to go, except that something kept calling them there. The galaxy called it the Path. It was not a space station, and it was not a planet, and it was not a ship. It was something older than all of those things, something built by hands that no longer existed, something left behind like a letter that had never been opened. And every species that learned how to fold space and travel between stars eventually heard its signal, a low, repeating pulse buried in the background noise of the universe, whispering the same set of coordinates over and over again, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The ones who built it were called the architects, though no one knew their real name, because they had been gone for longer than most species had been alive. That stars go, not with a scream, but with a slow dimming, that left behind only cold evidence that something bright had once been there. What they left behind was the Path, a structure the size of a small moon, covered in metal that no one could identify, and filled with corridors that changed when you were not looking, and rooms that had not existed a moment before you stepped into them. It was a test. Every species that found the Path and walked inside was measured and weighed and studied by whatever ancient intelligence still lived in its walls. And then the corridors would shift, and the rooms would rearrange, and the test would begin, tailored specifically to the species that had entered, designed to push them to the very edge of what they could endure, and then one step further. The reward for completing the Path was something called the cipher, a fragment of architect technology so advanced and so powerful that it could reshape the course of an entire civilization in a single generation, mastery over energy and matter and biology and space-time itself, the kind of knowledge that turned young species into old ones overnight. In 10,000 years of recorded galactic history, no species had ever completed the Path. Not one. The Veltari had entered first, or at least they were the first in living memory, a species of insectoid beings who shared a single mind across billions of bodies, who moved in perfect coordination and fought in perfect unity, and had never in their entire history known what it meant to be alone. The Path had separated them. It had pulled them apart, one by one, and placed each individual in a chamber of absolute silence, where no signal from the hive could reach. And for the first time in their existence, each Veltari had been forced to think a thought that belonged only to them. They had not been ready for that. Some went still and never moved again. Their minds simply stopped, like engines that had never been designed to run without a network. And the ones who survived pulled themselves out of the Path, shaking and hollow, and refused to ever speak of it again, passing laws that made even mentioning the Path a crime, punishable by exile from the hive. Then the Dralith had tried, the great reptilian warriors who had conquered a quarter of the galaxy through strength and pride and the absolute certainty that they were the finest beings ever to draw breath. The Path had not tested their strength. It had tested their softness, placing them in chambers where aggression was punished and gentleness was rewarded, where the only way forward was to admit fear, to show weakness, to say the words, "I do not know, and I am afraid, and I need help." The Dralith champions had raged against those walls until their claws were broken and their voices were raw, and then they had been expelled, thrown out of the Path like children who had failed to understand the lesson, and their empire had never fully recovered from the shame. Pause. The Solinari came next, beings of crystalline light who existed as pure mathematical consciousness, who could calculate the trajectory of every atom in a nebula and predict the death of stars 1 billion years before they dimmed. Pause. The Path had given them puzzles, and they had solved every single one, until the puzzles stopped being about numbers and started being about feelings. One chamber had presented them with a simple equation that could only be balanced by understanding grief. Not the concept of grief, not the definition, but the actual experience of losing something that mattered so deeply that the universe felt smaller without it. The Solinari could not process this. Some of them locked into recursive loops, trying to calculate an emotion, and never came out. Their crystalline forms still standing in those chambers, like frozen statues, beautiful and tragic, eternally incomplete. And then the Kavari had entered. The great aquatic diplomats, beings of such profound empathy that they could feel the emotions of other species across a room, who had built their entire civilization on connection and understanding, and the gentle art of knowing exactly what another being needed to hear. They had sailed through the emotional trials and the social puzzles and the tests of compassion like they had been born for them. And then the path had placed them alone in chambers of absolute physical hardship, cold and starvation, and pain that went on, without any other soul to share it with. The Kavari had crumbled. They were not built for solitude, and they were not built for endurance, and they had pulled themselves out of the path, weeping in frequencies that made other species nauseous with borrowed sorrow. Species after species after species, the clever ones, and the strong ones, and the ancient ones, and the proud ones. Each of them had entered the path, carrying the very best of what they were, and each of them had been broken by the very worst of what they were not. And then, 40 years after discovering faster-than-light travel, while the rest of the galaxy was still debating whether they were intelligent enough to sit at the adult table, the humans received the signal. It arrived on a Tuesday. The Galactic Council barely noticed. A few senior diplomats sent polite warnings through the standard channels, messages that amounted to, "Do not enter the path, little ones, for greater species than yours have shattered against its walls." And most of the galaxy assumed that would be the end of it, because surely the humans were smart enough to listen. The humans were not smart enough to listen. They never had been. Within 6 months of receiving the signal, a ship called the Meridian launched from Earth orbit, carrying 12 volunteers, not an army, not a battalion, even a proper scientific expedition, but 12 ordinary people selected through a process that baffled every species observing it. There was a soldier who had seen too many wars, and a poet who had seen too much beauty, and a nurse who had held too many hands in the dark. There was an engineer who loved problems, and a philosopher who loved questions, and a comedian who loved the sound of laughter in places where laughter should not exist. There was a farmer who still dreamed of wheat fields, and a musician who heard melodies in the hum of the ship's engine, and a teacher who could not stop explaining things, even when no one was listening. There was a grief counselor who carried other people's sadness like luggage she had volunteered to hold, and a firefighter who ran toward heat when every instinct said to run away, and an astrophysicist who looked at the universe and saw not emptiness, but invitation. 12 humans, fragile, short-lived, with no telepathy and no hive mind, and no crystalline perfection, and no armor and no claws, standing at the entrance of a structure that had broken civilizations older than their species' entire existence. The council observers watched from their ships, and some of them laughed, and some of them pitied, and one old Veltari ambassador simply transmitted a single phrase to her homeworld. "They are going in." The doors of the path opened. The 12 humans stepped inside, and somewhere deep within the ancient walls of the megastructure, for the first time in 10,000 years, something that had been sleeping began to shift. Every species that had ever entered the path had been scanned within seconds. The ancient intelligence inside the walls would reach into them like a hand dipping into water, reading their biology and their psychology and their history and their fears, and within moments the corridors would begin to shift, rearranging themselves into the specific shape of nightmare that would break that particular species the fastest. For the humans, It did not happen that way. The scan began normally. The walls hummed, and the air grew thick with something that was not quite sound and not quite light. And the 12 humans felt a pressure behind their eyes, like someone was reading a book that had been written on the inside of their skulls. But then the humming stopped, and nothing happened. The corridors did not shift. The rooms did not rearrange. The walls just stood there, silent and confused, like a machine that had been asked a question it did not have a category. 4. Outside the path, the observer ships noticed the delay immediately. Every species had been scanned and sorted within 30 seconds. But the humans had been standing in the entry corridor for nearly 4 minutes and counting, and the path had not moved. The Solinari representative ran the numbers and broadcast them to the council frequency. The calibration period was 7.2 times longer than any previously recorded instance, and it was still going. Something about the humans was confusing the path. It took 11 minutes before the corridors finally began to move, the longest calibration in the entire recorded history of the structure. And when the walls started shifting, the observer species noticed something else that had never happened before. The corridors were not settling into a single configuration but kept flickering between dozens of arrangements, as if the path could not decide what kind of test to build. But eventually, the walls stopped moving, and the lights changed, and the first trial began. The humans were separated. One moment they were standing together in a wide corridor, and the next the walls slid between them like blades, and each human was alone in a featureless white chamber, with no doors and no windows and no sound. The same isolation trial that had shattered the Velthari hive mind and left their people scarred for 3,000 years. The humans did not handle it well. The soldier, a woman named Reyes who had survived 3 ground wars and carried the memories like stones in her chest, began pacing immediately, her boots marking a path on the floor that wore grooves into the surface over what felt like days. And she cursed and she punched the walls and she screamed until her voice gave out. And then she sat in the corner and breathed and counted backward from 1,000 and started again. The poet, a thin man named Soren, who had spent his life finding words for things that did not have names, wept for what felt like a week straight, writing invisible poems on the walls with his finger, because the act of creating was the only thing that kept the silence from swallowing him whole. The farmer, a quiet man named Abel who had buried his wife 2 years before the mission, and had volunteered because he said the stars could not possibly be lonelier than an empty farmhouse, sat perfectly still and talked to the air as if his wife were sitting beside him, telling her about his day, asking her how the garden was doing, laughing at jokes only he could hear. They suffered. All 12 of them suffered, in their own ways, and none of them were graceful about it, and none of them looked like heroes. The firefighter cried so hard he gave himself a nosebleed, and the musician rocked back and forth, humming the same 4 bars a lullaby, over and over, and the comedian stood in the center of his chamber and performed a full stand-up set to an audience of absolutely no one, his voice cracking between jokes that were not funny and punchlines that sounded more like prayers. But not one of them broke. Not one of them went silent the way the Velthari had. Not one of them simply stopped, because even in the worst of it, even in the deepest pit of the loneliness, each of them found something inside themselves to hold on to, some small stubborn flame that refused to go out even when there was no oxygen left to feed it. When the walls finally opened, and the 12 of them stumbled back into each other, they did not speak for a long time. They just held each other. 12 strangers gripping 12 strangers, like drowning people who had found the same piece of wreckage, and the grief counselor whispered, "We are here, we are here, we are here," and it was enough. The path shifted again. This time it stripped them not of company, but of dignity, placing them in chambers where they were made to feel small and foolish, powerless. The same vulnerability trials that had broken the proud Drelith warriors who could not bear to be anything less than supreme. The philosopher, A calm woman named Adaze, who spoke like she was always translating from a language that had better words, looked at the humiliation and reframed it, saying, "This is not punishment, this is information." And the teacher, a patient man named Quan, who had spent 30 years explaining fractions to children who did not want to learn fractions, began turning each trial into a lesson, asking the group, "What is this trying to teach us?" instead of, "How do we fight this?" And then the soldier, proud, scarred, granite-faced Reyes, stood in front of the group and said in a voice that barely held together, "I am afraid." And she said it like it was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than any battle, harder than any wound. And the group did not laugh and did not look away. The comedian put his hand on her shoulder, said, "Yeah, me too." And the nurse nodded, and the farmer nodded. And one by one all 12 of them admitted the thing that the Draelith had died before saying. The path shifted. Now it gave them puzzles, beautiful, impossible puzzles, layered in mathematics and physics, and patterns that folded in on themselves like origami made of light. The same kind of challenges that the Solinari had devoured with ease, right up until the moment the puzzles stopped being logical. The astrophysicist and the engineer threw themselves at the equations and made real progress, their faces lit with the joy of problem-solving. But then the puzzles changed. They became tangled with something that had no formula, something that lived in the space between numbers, where calculation could not reach. The astrophysicist stared at one particular equation for 6 hours and said, "There is a variable here that I cannot identify." And the poet walked over and looked at it, and was quiet for a long time, and then said, "That is not a variable, that is loss. This equation is asking you what it feels like to lose something you cannot get back." And she told them about her mother, about the last Tuesday before the cancer took her, about the way her mother's hand had felt in hers, about the specific weight of a silence that used to be filled by someone's voice. And as she spoke, the equation on the wall began to change, rearranging itself not in response to calculation, but in response to feeling, and the chamber door opened. The path shifted one final time, and hit them with the thing that had destroyed the Kivari. Raw physical endurance, exhaustion, and cold and hunger and pain piled on top of each other until the body simply wanted to stop being a body. The firefighter carried the musician when her legs gave out, literally lifted her onto his back, and kept walking. And the farmer rationed their water with the same quiet precision he had once used to manage irrigation across 400 acres of drought-stricken land. And the nurse tore strips from her own clothing to bandage the engineer's bleeding feet, and did not complain about the cold on her bare arms. They did not excel at this. They were not built for it the way the Draelith were built for combat or the Shivari were built for connection. But they endured. They dragged themselves forward on stubbornness and mutual refusal to let each other fall. And when one of them faltered, the others pulled them up. And when another stumbled, the rest closed ranks around them, like a wall made of flesh and willpower. Outside the path, the Galactic Council watched, in a silence that had shifted from amusement to confusion to something that none of them had a word for. The humans were still inside, bleeding and crying and arguing and falling and getting back up, messy and loud and graceless and stubborn, and completely unwilling to accept the obvious truth that they were outmatched. The Velthari ambassador sat at her station and watched the telemetry data, and something cold moved through her ancient mind. Something she had not felt since her own people had been pulled screaming from those same corridors 3,000 years ago. She opened a channel to her homeworld and transmitted a single word: how. And deep inside the path, the walls kept shifting, but slower now, almost carefully, as if the ancient intelligence behind them was no longer trying to break the humans, but was instead trying to understand them. 43 days into the path, or at least what the humans believed was 43 days, because time inside the structure moved like water in a dream, sometimes fast, and sometimes slow, and sometimes sideways, in ways that made counting meaningless. Something happened that had never happened before in 10,000 years of recorded history. The path ran out of tests. Not completely. The ancient structure still had corridors and chambers and trials stretching out ahead of the 12 humans, like an ocean that had no far shore. But the standard tests, the ones that have been designed and refined and perfected over millennia to break every known category of intelligent life, had all been used. And the humans were still walking. So the path did something new. It began to create. The walls shifted in patterns that the observer species had never recorded. New geometries, new configurations, rooms that did not match any previous architecture. Solinari representative watching from outside calculated that the structure was generating trial types that had no precedent in any database, no match in any archive, no echo in any species' memory of their own time inside. The path was improvising. The first new trial was a moral dilemma. The 12 humans entered a chamber where a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere told them in calm, clear tones that one of them must remain behind for the others to proceed. That the door ahead would only open for 11. That this was not a trick, and not a simulation, and not a test of cleverness, but a simple mathematical truth. 12 entered, 11 continue, 1 stays forever. The humans looked at each other. Reyes the soldier stepped forward immediately and said, "Take me." And before the word had finished leaving her mouth, Abel the farmer said, "No, take me. I have the least to go back to." And then the firefighter said, "Neither of you. I am the least essential to." Group. And within 60 seconds, all 12 of them were arguing, not about who should be saved, but about who should be sacrificed. Each of them volunteering themselves with a ferocity that bordered on anger. The comedian, a man named Dev, whose laughter had kept the group sane through the isolation chambers, finally raised his hands and said, "Nobody is staying behind. That is stupid. We are going to find another way." And the group stopped arguing and started thinking. They spent 11 days in that chamber. 11 days of working through the problem from every angle. The engineer mapping the walls for structural weaknesses, while the philosopher questioned the logic of the premise, while the astrophysicist ran calculations on the energy signature of the door, while the poet sat in the corner and thought about what the room was actually asking beneath the words. On the 11th day, the teacher stood up and said, "The door says it will only open for 11. Say, it will not open for 13. And the group stared at him, and he explained that the question assumed subtraction, but what if the answer was addition? What if instead of leaving someone behind, they carried something extra forward, some piece of the room itself, some fragment of the trial, that would make 12 into more than 12? The engineer pulled a panel from the wall, and the musician sang a frequency she had been hearing in the structure's hum since the first day, and the panel resonated, and the door registered not 12 humans, but 12 humans and 1 fragment of itself, and the count read 13, and the door opened. The path accepted it. The walls shifted, with something that felt almost like surprise. The next trial was betrayal. The humans entered a series of connected chambers, and one by one began to encounter versions of their teammates that were wrong. Copies that looked perfect and sounded perfect, but were slightly off in ways that sat at the edge of perception, like a splinter under the skin. The comedian saw through it first. A copy of the nurse approached him in a corridor and said something kind and supportive and perfectly calibrated to make him feel better. Dev looked at her for a long moment and said, "That is not her. She would never say something kind that efficiently. The real Miriam takes 4 sentences to say what she could say in 1, because she wants you to feel the spaces between the words." The illusion dissolved. One by one, the humans identified the fakes, not through analysis or logic, but through the specific, intimate knowledge that comes from having suffered alongside someone, from knowing the exact way a person breathes when they are pretending to be fine, and the particular sound of their laugh when it is real versus when it is performance. The Dralith observers watched this from outside and could not understand it. In their culture, warriors knew each other by rank and combat record and the marks on their scales. And the idea that you could identify a comrade by the rhythm of their breathing was so foreign that their translators flagged it as a possible error. But the humans knew. The humans always knew. Because humans had spent their entire evolutionary history living in small groups, where survival depended not on strength or speed or armor, but on the ability to look at another human and understand in a single glance whether they were friend or threat, safe or dangerous, lying or telling the truth. And that ancient skill, that deep primate knowledge written into their bones by a million years of campfires and shared meals and watching each other's faces in the dark, was something no other species in the galaxy had developed to the same degree. The third new trial was the worst. Each human was placed alone in a private chamber and offered paradise. The room scanned them, deeper than before, deeper than thought. Into the place where desires lived that had no names. And then it built for each of them a perfect simulation of the thing they wanted most. The astrophysicist was given a laboratory with instruments that could see to the edge of the universe and data that would take 1,000 lifetimes to analyze. And she sat down at the console, and her hands were shaking with hunger for it. The musician was given a concert hall filled with beings from every species who had ever existed, all of them listening, all of them moved, and the sound that filled the room was so beautiful that she wept standing up. The soldier was given peace, a small house on a hill, with no enemies and no missions and no radio crackling with orders, just silence and sunlight and the certainty that no one would ever need her to kill again. And the farmer was given his wife. She stood in the kitchen of their farmhouse, with flour on her hands and sunlight in her hair. The way she had smiled at him every morning for 26 years and said, "You are home." And Abel felt something inside his chest crack open like dry earth receiving rain. He sat with her for 2 days. He told her about the mission and about the stars and about the way the light looked in the corridors of the path. And she listened, the way she had always listened, with her whole body leaning toward him, like a plant leaning toward the sun. And he held her hand and felt the warmth of it, and knew that it was not real, and held it anyway. On the second day he stood up and looked at her, and his face was wet, and he said, "You are not her, but thank you for letting me say goodbye." He walked out of the chamber, and the door closed behind him, and he did not look back, because he knew that if he looked back, he would never leave. Every human left their paradise, some quickly and some slowly, and some with wounds that would never fully heal. Walked out, and outside, the path, the Solinari representative, made a discovery, that it broadcast to the entire Galactic Council on every frequency simultaneously. The path is not just testing them, it said, in the precise crystalline tones of a being that had never before sounded uncertain. The path is being taught by them. The labyrinth has never encountered a species that is simultaneously mediocre in every single category and yet refuses to be defeated by any one of them. The transmission continued, and every species in the council heard the words that would later be carved into monuments on 100 worlds. The humans are not strong. They are adaptive. They are not logical. They are integrative. They do not have a single weakness for the path to exploit, because they have all the weaknesses, every single one, and they have built their entire civilization around the practice of compensating for them together. The Solinari were right. Every other species that had entered the path had entered as specialists, as beings who had perfected one way of existing, and had been broken when the test demanded another. The Veltari were unity without individuality. The Dralith were strength without softness. The Solinari were logic without feeling. The Kivari were empathy without resilience. But the humans were none of those things fully, and all of those things partially. A messy, contradictory, unstable species that contained every trait in imperfect measure, that could be logical in the morning and weep at a sunset by evening, that could fight with savage fury and then hold a child with impossible tenderness an hour later, that could sit alone for years and still remember how to love, that could stare into the void of existence and respond not with despair, but with a joke. The path had been designed to find a species' single flaw and break them with it. Species that already knew it was flawed, that had always known, and walked forward anyway. Deep inside the structure, the walls shifted again. But differently now. Not with the mechanical precision of a machine running a program, but with something that felt almost like curiosity, almost like wonder, almost like the ancient intelligence behind those walls was looking at these 12 fragile, impossible creatures, and asking itself for the first time in 10,000 years a question it did not already know the answer to. On what the humans believed was the 89th day, the corridors stopped changing. It happened without warning. One moment, the walls were shifting in their slow, restless way, rearranging the world around the 12 humans, the way they had been doing since the first step. And then all at once, everything went still, like a heart between beats, like the held breath before a word that cannot be taken back. The silence was so sudden and so total that Reyes reached for a weapon she did not have, and Dev made a joke that nobody laughed at. And the poet Soren stood very still with his eyes closed and said, "Something is different." He was right. Ahead of them the corridor stretched out straight and narrow and unmoving. The first time in nearly 3 months that any path inside the structure had remained in one shape long enough to trust. And at the far end there was a door. Not a shifting wall, or a sliding panel, or a flickering barrier of light, but an actual door. Solid and ancient, and covered in a material that looked like metal, but felt like memory. Cold to the touch, in a way that was not temperature, but time. As if the surface itself was old enough to remember things that the universe had forgotten. There was writing on the door. It was not in any human language, and it was not in any galactic language, and it was not in the symbolic notation of the architects that scholars had spent centuries trying to decode. And yet every human who looked at it understood it immediately. The way you understand the meaning of a face before you understand the words it is speaking. The way you know what thunder means before anyone teaches you the word for storm. The writing said, "Why do you continue?" That was all. No instructions, no conditions, no riddle wrapped inside a riddle. Just 4 words that were not a test, and not a challenge, and not a trap, but a genuine question, asked with something that felt like exhaustion, something that felt like hope, as if the thing asking had been waiting 10,000 years for someone to answer, and was afraid that the answer might not come. The 12 humans stood before the door and were quiet for a long time. It was Reyes who moved first, the soldier who had paced in the isolation chamber until her boots wore grooves in the floor, who had said, "I am afraid," in front of the group, and had not died from the saying of it. She stepped forward and placed her hand on the cold surface and said, "Because the people behind me are counting on me." The door did not open, but the writing pulsed, once, warm, like a heartbeat answering a heartbeat. Soren the poet stepped forward next, and his voice was soft and raw from 3 months of speaking in corridors where beauty had no business existing, and he said, "Because the beauty on the other side might be worth the pain." Miriam the nurse came after him, she who had torn her own clothing to bandage the body. Engineers' bleeding feet, who had held hands in hospital rooms on Earth, where holding a hand was the only medicine left, and she said, "Because someone has to." The engineer, a woman named Yuki, who loved problems the way other people loved music, who could not look at a broken thing without seeing the shape of its repair, said, "Because I want to see what comes next." Adeweze the philosopher, who had reframed humiliation as information and suffering as curriculum, who spoke in sentences that sounded like they had been translated from a language that understood more than this one, said, because the act of continuing is itself the meaning. Dev the comedian, who had performed stand-up to an empty room and called the void a tough crowd, whose laughter had been a rope that pulled 11 other people through the dark, said, because stopping would be boring and I hate being bored. Abel the farmer, who had held the hand of a wife who was not his wife, to a ghost, and had walked away from paradise because paradise without truth was just a beautiful cage, said, because the harvest does not care if you are tired. The musician, a woman named Lena, whose humming had been the only music in the silence, and whose ears had heard melodies hidden in the structure's hum that no instrument could play, said, because the song is not finished. Kwan the teacher, who had spent 30 years explaining the universe to people who did not want to learn about the universe and had never once stopped trying, said, because the ones who come after us need to know that it is possible. The grief counselor, a woman named Priya, who had whispered "We are here" in the dark after the isolation chambers, who carried other people's sadness not because she had to, but because she knew that sadness shared was sadness halved, said, because grief is not a reason to stop. It is proof that something mattered. The firefighter, a man named Tomas, who had carried the musician on his back when her legs failed, who ran toward fire because someone had to, and he had decided a long time ago that the someone would be him, said, because the fire does not wait for you to be ready. And the astrophysicist, a woman named Hannah, who had looked at the edge of the universe through a telescope when she was 9 years old, and had spent every day since trying to get closer to it, said, because the universe is under no obligation to make sense, but I am under every obligation to try. 12 answers, 12 reasons, none of them the same and all of them true, and the door stood silent for a long moment, as if it was reading not just the words, but the weight behind them, the years and the losses and the choices that had made each answer possible. And then it opened. Not dramatically, not with light or sound or ceremony. It simply swung inward, the way a door swings when it has been waiting a very long time to be opened, and is tired of being closed. The chamber beyond was enormous, a space so vast that the ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the walls curved away into distances that the eye could not track. And it was empty. There was no technology, and no glowing artifact, and no pedestal holding the secret of the universe. There was nothing except a mirror. It filled the entire far wall from floor to ceiling, a surface so perfectly smooth that it did not look like glass or metal, but like a window into a world that was almost, but not quite this one. And the 12 humans walked toward it and saw themselves, but not as they were. The mirror showed them as they had been on the day they entered the path, clean and rested and whole, and so terribly frightened. 12 ordinary people standing at the threshold of something they did not understand. And looking at those reflections now, after everything they had endured, was like looking at photographs of children who did not yet know what was coming. Then the reflection changed. The mirror showed other figures, not human, standing in the same chamber in the same posture of arrival. The Veltari with their gleaming carapaces and their billion-strong unity. The Dralith with their battle scars and their warrior pride. The Solinari with their crystalline light and their perfect logic. The Kivari with their fluid grace and their bottomless empathy. And dozens more, hundreds more, species that the humans had never heard of. Each one standing at this same threshold, each one brilliant and powerful and extraordinary in their own specific way. And each one turning back. Some turned back in fear, and some in confusion, and some in rage, and some simply went still, the way a light goes still when the power is cut. And the mirror showed them all, 10,000 years of brilliant, magnificent beings who had come so far and could not come the last step further. And then the mirror showed the architects. They did not look like gods. They did not look like the transcendent, all-knowing beings that the galaxy had imagined for 10,000 years. They looked tired and old and sad, like a species that had climbed as high as any species could climb, and had looked out from the top and seen that the view was lonely. Beings who had mastered energy and matter and space-time and biology, and had discovered that mastery without wholeness was just another kind of emptiness. They had built the path not as a test of worthiness, but as a search for a species that was whole, not perfect and not supreme, but whole. A species that carried within itself all the light and all the shadow and all the contradiction of what it meant to be alive, and did not try to cut away the parts that hurt. The mirror cleared, and a single line of architect text appeared on its surface, and the 12 humans read it, and the words settled into them like seeds into soil. Not what we expected. You are what we hoped for. The chamber changed. The mirror dissolved into light. Not the cold mathematical light of the Solinari, but warm light, alive light, light that felt like hands reaching out across 10,000 years to touch something they had almost given up believing they would ever find. And the light moved into the 12 humans. It did not burn, and it did not force. It settled into them gently, threading itself into their thoughts and their cells and their understanding, like a melody weaving itself into a song that had been waiting for it. And what it carried was not a weapon, and not a blueprint, and not a machine. It was understanding. A framework of perception so vast and so deep that a single human mind could hold only a fraction of it. A way of seeing the universe that would take humanity generations to fully unfold. Not the answers to every question, but something better, something more dangerous and more beautiful. The ability to ask questions that no one had ever thought to ask. The cipher was not a prize. It was an inheritance, left by a tired species to the first species whole enough to carry it. And as the light faded, and the 12 humans stood in the quiet of the empty chamber, breathing, alive, changed in ways they could not yet name, Hana, the astrophysicist, looked at the space where the mirror had been, and said in a voice that was barely a whisper, "They were looking for us." And the farmer Abel, who had buried a wife and said goodbye to a ghost and walked away from paradise, put his hand on her shoulder and said, "No, they were looking for anyone. We just happened to be the ones who showed up." And that, more than anything, was the most human thing any of them could have said. The doors of the path opened outward for the last time on what the galaxy would later call Day Zero. The day that divided history into everything that came before and everything that came after. The way a river divides a landscape into two countries that share the same sky but will never again be the same place. 12 humans walked out. They had been inside for 91 days, and they did not look like heroes. They looked like people who had been through something that language had not yet built words for. Gaunt and scarred, and carrying a light behind their eyes that had not been there when they entered. A light that made the council observers instinctively look away, the way you look away from the sun. Not because it is dangerous, but because some part of you understands that you are seeing something that is larger than your ability to see. The Galactic Council was assembled in full. Every species, every faction, every elder race, every young civilization had earned a seat, and every old one that had forgotten what it felt like to stand. All of them gathered in the space around the path, in a fleet so vast that from a distance it looked like a second galaxy forming around the ancient structure. No one spoke. And then the path did something that it had never done before. It closed. Not the way it usually reset between visitors, not the shifting and recalibrating and preparing for the next species. It sealed itself, the great doors pressing together with a sound that traveled through the vacuum on frequencies that should not have been possible. A sound that every ship in the fleet felt in their hulls, like the final note of a song that had been playing for 10,000 years. And then the lights began to go out. Section by section, corridor by corridor, the megastructure went dark, like a cathedral extinguishing its candles one by one, like a house whose owner has finally come home and no longer needs to. Leave the lights on, and the fleet watched in silence as the path folded itself into sleep for the first and last time. Its purpose was fulfilled. The search was over. The galaxy did not celebrate. There was awe, yes, but beneath the awe there was something colder and more complicated, something that tasted like fear in the mouths of species that had not felt fear in centuries. Because the youngest civilization in the galaxy, the one that had been exploring tide pools a geological heartbeat ago, the one that still argued about whether its own planet was getting too warm, now carried inside its 12 fragile representatives the most powerful knowledge the universe had ever produced. The political implications hit like a shockwave. The Dralith War Council convened within hours to discuss whether the humans could be compelled to surrender the cipher by force. And the Veltari retreated into emergency communion to process the existential shock of watching a species of individuals succeed where their perfect unity had failed. And the Solinari began running projections on every possible future, and found that in 93% of their models, the galaxy descended into conflict within a decade. Empires that had spent millennia building their power on the assumption that strength or logic or unity was the highest form of existence, were suddenly looking at a species that had none of those things in abundance, and asking themselves what their empires were actually built on. Fear makes civilizations do terrible things, and the galaxy was very afraid. But then the humans did something that broke every projection and shattered every model, and made the Solinari recalculate everything from the beginning. They shared it. Not the cipher itself, it was woven into human cognition at a level that could not be extracted or transferred or stolen. Encoded into the way they thought and felt and perceived, in patterns that were as unique to human neurology as music was to human ears. But the understanding it granted, the insights and the frameworks and the new ways of seeing that bloomed from it like flowers from seeds, those could be translated and those could be taught. And the humans taught. They went to the Velfari first, the species that had been broken by isolation 3,000 years ago, and had built walls around their traumas so thick that an entire civilization lived inside them. And the humans sat with them and said, "You are not wrong to value unity. Your unity is beautiful, but a unity that cannot survive individuality is a cage, not a home." And they taught the Velthari how to be alone without being lost, how to hold a thought that belonged to no one else and let it exist without fear, how to be one and also be many. The Velthari wept, all of them, billions of bodies weeping simultaneously, the first tears their species had ever shed. And when they stopped weeping, they were not broken, they were wider. They were a hive that had learned to hold space for the singular, and the sound they made was a sound the galaxy had never heard before, the hum of a billion individuals choosing to be together. They went to the Dralith, the warriors whose pride had been their armor and their prison, and they did not tell them to be weak. They told them that vulnerability was not the opposite of strength, but the source of it, that the bravest thing a warrior could do was not to fight, but to put down the weapon and say, "I do not need this to be worthy." And the Dralith, those ancient, proud, unbreakable reptilian warriors, listened, and some of them understood, and the ones who understood became something new, something the galaxy had no name for, warriors who could be gentle without being diminished. They sat with the Solinari, those perfect crystalline minds who could calculate the death of stars, but could not calculate the weight of a goodbye. Grief counselor Priya sat with them for months, teaching them that grief was not an error in the system, but a signal that something had mattered, that the inability to compute love was not a flaw in their logic, but evidence that some things existed beyond logic's reach. And the first Solinari, who successfully experienced sorrow, shattered into 1,000 pieces, and then reformed into something that contained light in colors it had never been able to produce before. They swam with the Kivari, those beautiful empathic beings who could feel everything except endurance. And the firefighter Tamaz floated beside them in their warm oceans, and said, "You do not have to stop feeling in order to survive. You just have to feel it and keep swimming." And he told them about fires he had walked into, knowing he might not walk out, and about the choice to keep moving when every nerve was screaming stop. And the Kivari listened with their whole bodies, the way their species always listened. Something in them shifted. Something that allowed them to hold both tenderness and tenacity in the same current. Species after species, the humans went to every civilization that had attempted the path and failed. And they did not say, "We are better than you." And they did not say, "You were not good enough." They said, "You were extraordinary in ways that we are not, and we were ordinary in ways that happened to be what was needed. And now, let us show you what we learned, so that all of us can be more than we were." They did not hoard, they did not conquer, they did not leverage, they did not build an empire on the cipher, or use it to become kings of a galaxy that had expected them to try. They taught, and the galaxy, slowly and reluctantly, and with great difficulty, began to learn. Years later, long enough for the shock to fade, and the politics to settle, and the new reality to become simply reality, the elder species began to understand something that had been staring them in the face since the 12 humans first walked out of those ancient doors. The architects had not designed the path to find the strongest species. They had not designed it to find the smartest, or the most unified, or the most logical, or the most empathetic. They had designed it to find the species most likely to do exactly what the humans were doing right now. The species that would walk through its own personal hell, and come out the other side, and instead of claiming victory, would turn around and hold the door open for everyone else. That was the test. Not the path itself. The path was just the filter. The real test was what happened after, and the architects had known that the species that could pass the path would be the same species that would share what it found, because the qualities that allowed it to endure, adaptability, empathy, stubbornness, humility, the ability to hold contradiction without breaking, were the same qualities that would prevent it from hoarding power. The Velthari ambassador, the old one, the one who had transmitted how on the first day and had watched everything that followed with the patient attention of a being who had lived long enough to see civilizations rise and fall like tides, sent one final transmission to her homeworld, a transmission that was later translated into every language in the galaxy and carved into the walls of the council chamber itself. The path did not align for the humans because they were superior. It aligned because they were the only species that would walk through hell and then turn around and hold the door open for the rest of us. And on a quiet day, many years after all of this, when the galaxy had changed in ways both vast and subtle, and the story of the 12 humans had become the kind of story that children heard before sleep and elders quoted in moments of doubt, a small human ship traveled to the dark megastructure that had once been the path. The poet stepped out. Soren was older now, gray-haired and walking with a cane, and carrying in his face the map of everywhere he had been since the day he wrote invisible poems on the walls of an isolation chamber. And he walked alone across the cold surface of the docking platform to the sealed doors that would never open again. He placed his hand against the metal that was not metal, the surface that was cold with time rather than temperature. And he stood there for a long while, feeling the age of it beneath his palm. 10,000 years of waiting condensed into a silence so deep that it had its own gravity. He whispered 4 words, "Thank you for asking us why." And then he turned and walked back to his ship, where representatives of 11 different species were waiting to fly home together. And he climbed aboard, and the ship pulled away, and the dark structure grew small behind them, until it was just another point of stillness in the vast and turning dark. And behind them, unseen and unheard, deep within the dead circuitry of the path, in a place where no signal could reach and no sensor could detect, a single light flickered, brief and warm, the way a candle flickers when someone it loves walks into the room. And then it went still, and the galaxy, messy and fractured and healing and whole, kept turning.